In the final winter of the Second World War, as the Allies pushed deep into Germany, a new sound echoed across the frozen roads of the Rhineland. It was deeper than the growl of a Sherman, slower, heavier, a mechanical rhythm that spoke of power long withheld. That sound belonged to the M26 Pershing. For years, the American Tank Corps had fought with machines that were quick and dependable, but outgunned by their German opponents. When a Sherman faced a Tiger or a Panther head-on, its survival often depended on numbers, on flanking maneuvers, on air support. The soldiers inside knew it. They called their tanks Ronsons because they lit up easily once hit. Back in Washington, engineers have been working in secrecy and frustration to build something better, a tank that could stand on equal ground with the enemy's best. But progress moved slowly through layers of command, constrained by a doctrine that saw tanks as infantry support rather than instruments of armor dominance. General Leslie McNair, head of Army Ground Forces, believed in the tank destroyer concept. Let tanks fight men and let self-propelled guns fight tanks. His logic was simple and disastrously wrong. While the Germans poured resources into perfecting the Panther and the Tiger, the Americans mass-produced the Sherman. Quantity over quality, mobility over armor. It was a philosophy that worked in North Africa and Italy, but as the war reached the forests and cities of Western Europe, the balance began to shift. In the snowbound fields of the Ardennes, the German counteroffensive, the Battle of Bulge, exposed the limits of that philosophy. Shermans burned by the dozens. The cries for a heavier, better protected tank became impossible to ignore. From the Ordnance Department came a design that had been waiting in the shadows since 1942. Its engineers called it the T-26, armed with a 90mm gun and layered with thick, sloped armor. General Jacob Devers championed it relentlessly, arguing that America needed a true heavy tank. But each request met resistance. Logisticians warned it would be too heavy for European bridges. Commanders insisted that shipping such a machine across the Atlantic was wasteful. McNair himself dismissed it as unnecessary, claiming that no American doctrine called for tank versus tank warfare. Devers ignored them. He went over McNair's head to General George C. Marshall, who finally approved production in December 1943. Even then, it would take almost another year before the first Pershings rolled off the line. By the time they reached Antwerp in January 1945, Germany was already collapsing. But the men who received those tanks knew they were about to test a machine that symbolized everything the American armored forces had waited for. In late February, as rain turned the roads to mud near the Roer River, the 3rd Armored Division advanced toward the town of Elsdorf. Among them was a brand-new Pershing named Fireball. As dusk fell, 3 German Tigers emerged from the east. The first duel lasted only seconds. Fireball was caught in the open, struck 3 times at point-blank range, and disabled. 2 crewmen died in the flames. But the next day, another Pershing returned the favor, destroying a Tiger and 2 Panzer IVs with precise shots fired on the move. The balance of power had shifted, if only for a moment. Weeks later, in the ruins of Cologne, an American Pershing known as Eagle 7 faced a German Panther in one of the war's most famous tank duels. Filmed by an Army cameraman, the battle lasted barely a minute. The Panther fired first and missed. The Pershing fired back 3 times. Each round tore through the German tank's armor. It was the last great armored duel of the war, and a glimpse of what might have been if the Pershing had arrived sooner. When American troops crossed the Rhine at Remagen, Pershing stood on the west bank, their guns covering the first Allied bridgehead into the heart of Germany. They had arrived too late to change the war, but just in time to change the future of tank warfare. Because the Pershing was more than a machine. It was the proof that American industry could produce not only quantity, but excellence. And though its combat career in Europe was brief, its design would evolve into the Patton series. Tanks that would fight in Korea, in Vietnam, and across the Cold War decades. The M26 Pershing had missed its war, but it had defined an era. In the early years of the Second World War, the United States Army looked at its armored forces with confidence. The M4 Sherman had proven itself reliable, mobile, and easy to build. It was a tank that rolled off assembly lines faster than any other in history, a symbol of American industry answering the Cold War. Its design reflected the philosophy that speed, logistics, and numbers could overcome the enemy's strength. When the Sherman first appeared in the deserts of North Africa, it seemed to validate that idea. It outclassed most of the German and Italian tanks it met there, combining dependable mechanics with just enough armor to survive the battlefield. But by late 1942, the landscape of armored warfare was changing. The German army was introducing a new generation of tanks, the Panther and the Tiger, machines that redefined what heavy armor could do. These were not the thin-skinned panzers of the early campaigns. They carried thick, sloped armor that could deflect almost any Allied round, and long-barrel guns capable of piercing a Sherman before it even came within range. For the American crews who faced them, each encounter felt like a duel fought at a disadvantage. A Sherman 75mm gun could barely scratch a Panther's frontal armor. Its only hope lay in maneuvering to strike from the side or calling for artillery and air support. Reports in the field began to paint a worrying picture. In Tunisia, in Italy, and later in Normandy, tank battalions were losing vehicles faster than replacements could arrive. Crews were brave, but bravery could not overcome steel and physics. Each destroyed Sherman meant 5 men at risk, 5 lives inside a machine that had become outmatched. Back in the United States, a quiet debate began to take shape among engineers and commanders. The Ordnance Department, responsible for weapons development, had already started experimenting with a new series of designs, the so-called T-Series. The first of them, the T-20, took shape in early 1942. It was intended as an improved medium tank that could eventually replace the Sherman. It had a lower silhouette, thicker armor, and a new 76mm gun. It also tested a different type of suspension, using horizontal volute springs to improve stability. The concept seemed promising, but the Army was cautious. Each improvement added complexity and weight, and with the Sherman performing well in the field, there was little motivation to change. The next prototypes, the T-22 and T-23, refined the idea further. The T-23 even tested an experimental electric drive system designed by General Electric, inspired by German research into the Porsche Tiger. It worked in theory, but in practice, the system was heavy and difficult to maintain. As months passed, the Ordnance Department kept pushing forward, trying to find the right balance between power, protection, and practicality. In mid-1943, 2 new variants emerged, the T-25 and the T-26. Both carried a 90mm gun, the same weapon used by American anti-aircraft batteries, and later mounted on tank destroyers like the M26 Jackson. The difference lay in their armor. The T-25 retained moderate protection, while the T-26 added thick, sloped frontal plating nearly 4 inches deep, a significant leap forward in survivability. But while engineers were ready to move ahead, doctrine was not. General Leslie McNair, commanding the Army Ground Forces, opposed the idea of a heavy tank. He believed that tanks were meant to support infantry, not fight other tanks. Enemy armor, in his view, should be destroyed by specialized units, fast, lightly armored vehicles called tank destroyers. This doctrine shaped the American approach to armored warfare throughout the war. It emphasized maneuver, flexibility, and economy, values that made sense on paper but would later prove costly in blood and steel. McNair's influence was enormous. He controlled what weapons were ordered, tested, and shipped overseas. To him, the Sherman was good enough. The tank destroyers were the real answer to enemy armor, and any attempt to build a 40-ton tank was unnecessary and wasteful. He argued that such a vehicle would strain shipping, bridges, and roads, and that its slow speed would make it vulnerable on the battlefield. Yet, reports from the front told a different story. By the time American troops landed in Normandy in June of 1944, they were facing German Panthers in large numbers. The 75mm gun of the Sherman could not penetrate the Panther's frontal armor even at close range. The improved 76mm version helped, but only marginally. Tankers began calling their vehicles Ronsons after the lighter that always lit on the first strike. Inside the Ordnance Department, frustration grew. They had a design that could solve this problem, the T-26, but it remained stuck in testing and debate. Lieutenant General Jacob Devers, then commanding the armored force, became one of its fiercest advocates. He understood that the war's tempo demanded more than doctrine. He wanted a tank that could take the initiative, survive a hit, and strike back harder. Devers pushed for the immediate production of the T-26, even suggesting that one should be issued for every 5 Shermans in service, a balanced combination of mobility and power. But his proposal met resistance from nearly every level above him. Commanders worried about logistics. McNair insisted the Sherman was still adequate. Only after Devers went directly to General George C. Marshall in December of 1943 did things begin to change. Marshall listened. He overruled McNair and authorized the production of 250 units of the new T-26E1, later refined into the T-26E3, the tank that would be officially named the M26 Pershing. But even with authorization secured, time was lost. Factories had to retool, components had to be tested, and priorities had already shifted toward the final invasion of Europe. By the time the first Pershings rolled off the line in November of 1944, it was already clear they would arrive too late to alter the course of the war. Still, within that delay lay the seed of a revolution. For the first time, an American tank combined true heavy armor with a high-velocity gun, and a suspension capable of absorbing the weight of both. It represented a turning point in design philosophy, the moment when American engineers stopped imitating and began leading. The Pershing was not just a machine of steel and fire. It was a product of an argument between the past and the future, between doctrine and innovation. And as Europe descended into its final battles, the Pershing would finally have its chance to prove who had been right all along. By the time the M26 Pershing reached production, it carried the weight of every lesson the American Armored Corps had learned the hard way. It was not just a new tank. It was a declaration that the United States could build something equal to the best that Germany had to offer. Its creation was a synthesis of technology, necessity, and the pressure of war closing in. The heart of the Pershing was its Ford JF V8 gasoline engine, producing roughly 450 horsepower. This was, in fact, the same engine that powered later models of the Sherman. But while the Sherman weighed just over 30 tons, the Pershing tipped the scales at more than 41. That difference meant that the engine was working constantly at its limit, driving a machine that demanded more torque than it could easily provide. As a result, the Pershing was slow, only about 40 kilometers per hour on the road, and barely ate across broken terrain. It could not match the speed of the Sherman or the Panther. Yet, what it lacked in agility, it compensated for with presence. When the Pershing rolled into view, its silhouette told a different story from the tall, boxy lines of Sherman. The hull was lower, the armor sloped, and the turret cast in a single massive piece. The design emphasized protection and a stable firing platform. The frontal glacis was nearly 100 millimeters thick, angled to deflect incoming rounds. It was the first American tank that could withstand a hit from the feared German 75mm KWK 42 gun at medium range. At its center stood the M3 90mm gun, a weapon originally designed for anti-aircraft use and later adapted for tank warfare. It was long, powerful, and precise, firing armor-piercing rounds that could punch the frontal plate of a Tiger from over 1,000 meters. The gun carried 70 rounds, giving the crew ample endurance for prolonged engagements. It was equipped with a gyro stabilizer, allowing the gun to keep his aim on target even as the tank moved, a rare and advanced feature for the time, one that few Allied or Axis tanks possessed. The rest of the armament followed the typical American pattern. 2 Browning M1919 machine guns of 7.62 millimeters, one coaxial with the main gun, and another mounted at the bow, plus a heavy Browning M2 of 12.7 millimeters on the turret roof, used against aircraft or soft targets. Together, these weapons gave the Pershing flexibility in combat, allowing it to respond to both infantry assaults and armored threats. But the Pershing's innovation ran deeper than its gun and armor. Beneath its hull, the engineers introduced a torsion bar suspension, the first of its kind on an American production tank. Each road wheel was connected to a steel bar that twisted under pressure, absorbing shocks evenly across the vehicle's weight. The result was a smoother ride, better cross-country mobility, and more accurate gunnery, while moving. This suspension would become the foundation of all future American tanks, from the Patton to the Abrams. The turret layout was carefully designed for efficiency. 5 men operated the tank: the commander, gunner, loader, driver, and bow machine gunner, who also served as radio operator. Inside, space was tighter than in the Sherman, but better organized. The gun breech dominated the fighting compartment, while ammunition was stored in racks low along the sides to reduce the risk of detonation. An improved ventilator system helped clear smoke after each shot, a small but vital change that kept the crew alert during extended combat. Externally, the Pershing carried a visual language of evolution. Its rounded turret blended into the hull with almost organic smoothness, a sign of cast steel manufacturing techniques refined during years of production. Large side skirts protected the suspension from mud and shrapnel. The rear deck was wide, with hinge panels giving mechanics easy access to the engine and transmission, a necessity, given how often they would need it. For all its strengths, the Pershing was far from perfect. Its transmission was an old friend with new problems. The Torque-Matic system, a hydromechanical drive adapted from earlier prototypes, proved fragile under stress. Breakdowns were common, especially during extended maneuvers or sudden gear changes. In field tests, many tanks suffered failures after only a few hundred kilometers. Mechanics joked that the Pershing could win any duel, as long as it managed to get there first. Fuel consumption was another challenge. The tank's engine burned through its supply quickly, reducing its operational range to about 160 kilometers on road conditions. In the dense, fuel-hungry logistics of the European campaign, that meant more refueling stops and tighter coordination with supply convoys. Still, to the crews who received them, these were minor concerns compared to the feeling of power they now commanded. For the first time, American tankers could look at a German Tiger and know that they had the means to fight on equal terms. They could take a hit, fire back, and win. In psychological terms, that change was immeasurable. Every detail of the Pershing's construction spoke of late-war American industry at its peak. Factories in Detroit and Grand Blanc were running around the clock, welding armor plates, casting turrets, and fitting engines under the supervision of the Ordnance Department. Each tank was a symbol of engineering persistence against doctrinal resistance. What had begun as an experimental project in 1942 had finally become a production reality in late 1944. At the Detroit Tank Arsenal, workers assembled the first 10 tanks in November, 30 in December, 70 in January, and nearly 200 by February of 1945. As those numbers climbed, a select group of soldiers in Europe were preparing to test them under fire. The Pershing was not just a new tank. It was an improving idea that carried the expectations of an entire generation of armored warfare. Commanders studied the technical manuals with care. They knew its armor was strong, but its power plant weak, that its firepower was unmatched, but its reliability uncertain. And yet, when the first Pershings rolled off the docks in Antwerp, the men who saw them could not help but feel awe. The tank looked nothing like the Shermans they had driven across France. It sat lower, heavier, its turret massive and confident, its gun stretching forward like a statement of intent. It was not a defensive weapon, it was a hunter. As the winter of 1945 dragged on, the roads of Belgium and the Rhineland filled with the rumble of these new machines. Each one carried the hopes of those who had waited too long for them. They represented the closing chapter of American wartime innovation, a fusion of engineering skill and battlefield necessity that had finally broken through years of doctrine and delay. The Pershing was ready. The men were ready. And the war, in its final and most desperate months, was about to give both their ultimate test. In the cold rain of February 1945, a new shape began to move along the muddy roads of western Germany. Its engine growled with a deep mechanical pulse. Slower than familiar Sherman, heavier, more deliberate. For the soldiers of the 3rd Armored Division, that sound meant something new had arrived. They called it the Pershing. Only 20 of them had been sent to Europe, divided between the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions. They had come through Antwerp aboard transport ships, untested and unfamiliar to most crews. Training began almost immediately. Manuals were opened, engines inspected, range finders adjusted. The tankers who had spent years in Shermans climbed into their new machines with a mix of excitement and caution. The hull was thicker, the gun far larger, the controls heavier to the touch. But there was confidence, too, the feeling that they finally had a weapon worthy of the enemy they faced. Their baptism would come quickly. On the 26th of February, near the towns of Jülich and Düren, American forces were pushing eastward across the Ruhr River. Their goal was the Rhine, the great natural barrier guarding the heart of Germany. Among the lead elements was Task Force Wellborn of the 3rd Armored Division, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Wellborn. The terrain ahead was rough, pitted with shell craters and thick mud from weeks of rain. The German defense was scattered but determined. Remnants of the 9th and 11th Panzer Divisions had taken up positions in the forest near the village of Elsdorf. That afternoon, one of the new Pershings, serial number 44, moved forward. Its crew had named it Fireball. As dusk fell, they approached a barricade of logs and rubble at the edge of the village. German infantry were retreating, but as Fireball advanced, 3 Tiger tanks from Heavy Panzer Battalion 301 arrived from the east. The first Sherman behind Fireball burst into flames almost instantly, hit by an 88mm shell. The fire illuminated the Pershing's dark shape against the night sky, making it a perfect target. A Tiger fired again 100 yards, point blank. The first round struck the gun mantlet, punching through the steel. A second round hit the turret ring. A third penetrated the armor, killing the gunner and loader. Fireball stopped, silent in the darkness. The victory was brief. Moments later, as a German tank reversed into cover, it became stuck in the ruins and was abandoned. The following morning, the Americans retook the ground, recovered Fireball, and began repairs that would return her to service within days. It was a grim but revealing first encounter, a lesson in both the Pershing's resilience and its vulnerability under surprise fire. The next day, the same division struck back. Task Force Lovelady, positioned southeast of Elsdorf, engaged a German counterattack, led by 4 Tigers and 2 Panzer IVs. From over 1,000 yards away, Sergeant Nicholas Mashlanik's Pershing, number 40, opened fire. 4 armor-piercing rounds found their mark in rapid succession, destroying a Tiger while on the move. Minutes later, he spotted 3 more enemy tanks retreating along a narrow road. He waited until they lined up, rear armor exposed, and fired 3 precise shots. All 3 targets burst into flames. For the first time, American crews saw what their new 90mm gun could do when used with precision and calm. Elsdorf was theirs. Within a week, another battlefield would immortalize the Pershing's name. As the 3rd Armored Division advanced into the city of Cologne, resistance stiffened. The Germans were fighting street by street, turning every intersection into a trap. Among the ruins near Cathedral, a Panther lay in ambush, its long 75mm gun aimed down a narrow boulevard. 2 Shermans, unaware of the danger, rolled into view. The first was hit instantly, exploding in a burst of fire that lit the shattered buildings around it. The second pulled back, unable to advance. From a side street, a Pershing of Company E, call sign Eagle 7, received the order to engage. Its gunner, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, could see the Panther's muzzle flash reflecting against the cathedral's stained glass. He traversed the turret, lined up the shot, and fired while still moving. The first round struck low, beneath the gun mantlet. The second hit squarely on the turret side. The third tore through the hull, igniting the ammunition inside. The Panther's crew tried to escape, but only 2 made out alive. The rest perished in the fire. A U.S. Army cameraman, Sergeant Jim Bates, captured the entire duel on film. The footage, grainy and unflinching, became one of the most iconic images of armored warfare, a silent mechanical execution in the ruins of a dying city. It was proof, undeniable and visceral, that the Pershing could stand toe-to-toe with the best of the German tanks. From that moment on, morale within the armored divisions changed. The men no longer felt outmatched. They had a weapon that could meet the Tiger and the Panther's equals, perhaps even surpass them. But the Pershing's test was not yet over. In early March, the 9th Armored Division approached the Rhine near a small town called Remagen. Reconnaissance units reported an unexpected discovery: the Ludendorff Bridge still standing, one of the last intact crossings over the river. If the Americans could capture it, they would gain a direct route into the heart of Germany. At 11 in the morning on the 7th of March, Lieutenant Carl Timberman led his infantry forward, supported by Company A of the 14th Tank Battalion. Among his support was a platoon of Pershings. German defenders fired Panzerfaust and machine guns from the eastern bank, but the Pershings returned fire with deadly accuracy. One tank engaged a German machine gun nest on the bridge tower, silencing it with a single shell. Another destroyed a barge-mounted position upstream, clearing the approach for the assault. By 1 in the afternoon, American infantry were charging across the bridge under constant fire. At 3:20, Timberman's men reached the far bank, establishing the first Allied foothold east of the Rhine. The bridge was damaged and shaking, but it held. Pershing crews waited impatiently on the western side, ready to follow. They knew the bridge could not bear their full weight, and yet they also knew that without them, the crossing would remain vulnerable. When the order finally came, only lighter Shermans and tank destroyers were allowed to pass first. The Pershing stood guard, firing across the river to suppress German counterattacks. Their shells cracked through the afternoon air, covering the most daring advance of the campaign. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge was one of the last great surprises of the war. Within days, engineers had built additional crossings, and the Allied push into Germany accelerated. The Pershing had played a critical part, not through numbers, but through presence. It was the spearhead of a new kind of American armor, and though the war was nearing its end, it had arrived just in time to make its mark. Across the battlefields of Western Europe, stories of the Pershing spread quickly. Tankers spoke of its power, its stability, its gun that could kill with one shot. They also spoke of its flaws, the transmission failures, the slow climb on muddy slopes, the endless demand for fuel. But for all its imperfections, one truth stood above all. The men trusted it. After years of fighting in machines that struggled against German armor, the Pershing gave them something they had almost forgotten: confidence. By April, American forces were sweeping across Germany. In one of the final armored duels of the war, a modified Super Pershing, fitted with an experimental long-barrel gun, faced a German King Tiger near Dessau. The two giants traded shots at close range. The Tiger fired first and missed. The Pershing answered with a round that struck the underside of the enemy's hull, detonating its ammunition. The explosion lifted the Tiger's turret into the air. It was a fitting final act, the last duel of an era, fought between two machines that embodied the extremes of wartime engineering. For the men who witnessed it, the Pershing was no longer just a tank. It was the promise of a new generation, proof that America had finally mastered the art of heavy armor. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing under its own weight. German cities lay in ruins, rail lines shattered, fuel reserves nearly gone. And yet, even in its dying months, the Third Reich still managed to field its fearsome Tigers and Panthers, fighting with the same precision that had once made them the masters of armor war. Against them, the M26 Pershing had finally arrived, a weapon conceived too late, but in time to reveal what the future would look like. To the crews who fought in those final weeks, the difference was immediate. They had spent years watching their Shermans burn, hearing the sharp crack of German shells before they ever saw the flash. Now, when the Pershing advanced, it did so with quiet confidence. Its armor no longer felt like a compromise, and its gun no longer a plea for luck. The 90mm M3 gave them parity, and that parity changed everything. In the battlefields beyond the Rhine, tank engagements were no longer desperate struggles for survival, but calculated duels of skill and patience. Crews began to trust their machines again. They could hold position, fire from cover, and trade shots without immediate fear of being torn apart. For the first time since North Africa, American armor could dominate through presence, not just through numbers. But the Pershing's influence extended beyond its few dozen units in Europe. Its arrival forced the American command to confront a truth that had been avoided for years. That doctrine had fallen behind reality. The belief that lightly armored tank destroyers could counter the enemy's heavy armor had proven flawed. In practice, tank destroyer battalions had performed bravely, but their open-top vehicles lacked protection to survive prolonged combat. The Pershing, with its balance of firepower and armor, was the real answer the battlefield had demanded all along. Officers in the field knew it. Reports from the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions described the Pershing's performance with a mixture of admiration and regret that accompanies every "what if" in history. What if these tanks had arrived in Normandy a year earlier? What if they had met the tigers in the hedgerows of France rather than the ashes of Cologne? Those questions could not change the past, but they would shape the future. When the war ended in May, the United States Army began reviewing its armor doctrine with unprecedented urgency. The lessons were clear. The tank destroyer concept had failed, and heavy armor was essential. The Pershing, though technically classified as a heavy tank, represented the beginning of a new philosophy, one that sought the ideal balance between protection, firepower, and mobility. It was a transition point between the light, fast Shermans of the early war and the main battle tanks of the modern age. The psychological effect of this transition cannot be overstated. In war, machines are not just tools. They are symbols. The Sherman had symbolized reliability in numbers, an industrial answer to a tactical problem. The Pershing symbolized something deeper, a recognition that quality can no longer be sacrificed for quantity. Its thick armor and massive gun projected confidence, not compromise. Every soldier who saw it understood instinctively that it was a weapon built for the kind of war the world was about to enter, a war defined by steel and fire, not trenches and mud. In many ways, the Pershing's late appearance reflected the paradox of American wartime innovation. The United States possessed unmatched industrial power, yet its doctrines had been conservative, cautious, and bureaucratic. Innovation was not limited by engineers, but by the ideas of those who commanded them. It took the shock of facing German heavy armor and the losses that followed to push change forward. The Pershing was that change-made metal. Even in small numbers, its presence altered Allied operations. German commanders reported encounters with new American Tigers, mistaking the Pershing for a much heavier vehicle. The psychological impact spread quickly across the front. Where once the sight of the Tiger had inspired fear, now American crews could answer with something equally imposing. In that sense, the Pershing fought not only with shells and steel, but with perception itself. In March and April, as the Allies swept the Ruhr and into central Germany, Pershings led armored columns into shattered towns and cities. In combat, they were steady and precise, moving deliberately through rubble-strewn streets where every window could hide an enemy. Their heavy hulls absorbed hits that would have crippled a Sherman. Their guns fired through walls and pillboxes, breaking the last resistance of the Wehrmacht's armored core. Each engagement reaffirmed what the engineers in Detroit had promised. The Pershing could win head-on. Yet it was a victory tinged with melancholy. The crews knew their tank had arrived too late to change the outcome of the war. By the time most units received their Pershings, the German army was already collapsing, its fuel gone, its air cover shattered. In truth, the Pershing was a weapon for a war that was already ending. But wars do not end cleanly. In those final weeks, every tank, every crossing, every duel still carried the weight of lives and history. When peace came, the Pershing did not vanish into storage like so many wartime machines. Instead, it became the foundation for a transformation. Its design was too good, too forward-thinking to be forgotten. Engineers studied the performance and began drafting upgrades, a stronger engine, a revised transmission, improved fire control. These modifications would lead to a new name, the M26 patent, and from there, to a family of tanks that would define the next half-century of American armor. But before that evolution began, the Pershing itself became a bridge between two worlds. It was both the last heavy tank of the Second World War and the first of the modern era. It introduced technologies, torsion bar suspension, cast turret, and advanced optics that would become standard. It also redefined how the United States approached the concept of armored warfare. No longer would the tank be merely a support weapon. It would become the spearhead, the decisive instrument of land combat. The men who had fought in Shermans and ended the war in Pershings understood this better than anyone. They had seen the cost of delay, the lives lost in inadequate machines, the battles won only through sacrifice. To them, the Pershing was more than a tank. It was vindication, a proof that the lessons written in blood on the fields of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes had finally been learned. When they parked their Pershings on the streets of Cologne, under the shadow of the cathedral they had fought to capture, they did not see just a weapon. They saw a promise that the next war, if it ever came, would be fought with the right tools from the start. That promise would guide American armor into the Cold War, where the ghost of the Pershing would live on in every tank that bore its silhouette. The war had turned. The old doctrines had fallen, and from the smoke and steel of its final battles, the Pershing had given birth to a new age of tanks, an age in which the balance of fire, armor, and mobility would define victory itself. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the M26 Pershing stood in the streets of ruined cities, Cologne, Remagen, Dessau, symbols of victory that had come too late to change the war, but just in time to shape the peace that followed. In the summer of 1945, the war in the Pacific still raged, and plans were already underway to ship the Pershing across the ocean for the final invasion of Japan. 12 tanks were loaded aboard a cargo ship bound for Okinawa in late May. They arrived in early August, only days after the fighting had ended. The Pershing had crossed half the world to find that its war was already over. Yet history was not finished with it. The Pershing represented the next step in the evolution of American armor. Too heavy to be ignored, too important to be discarded. In the years that followed, it became both a teacher and a prototype, guiding the United States Army into a new era of mechanized warfare. In May of 1946, the Army reclassified the Pershing from a heavy tank to a medium one, reflecting the rapid changes in post-war thinking. The lesson of the Second World War had been clear. Tanks could no longer be divided rigidly into light, medium, and heavy categories. They needed to combine all three, firepower, protection, and mobility, in a single balanced design. The Pershing, though born under the title of heavy, fit that philosophy perfectly. More than 2,000 units were built by the Detroit Tank Arsenal and the Fisher Tank Division between 1944 and 1945. Many of them remained in service after the war, stationed with occupation forces in Germany and Japan. They became the backbone of America's post-war armored divisions, their massive silhouettes now patrolling the quiet streets of defeated cities. But peace did not last long. By the late 1940s, tensions between East and West began to harden into the outlines of a new conflict. The world was dividing again, and once more, tanks would take the front line. The Pershing's first major evolution came in 1948. Engineers at the Detroit Arsenal began upgrading the existing tanks with a new power plant, the Continental AVDS 1790 12-cylinder engine, producing more than 800 horsepower. The old Torque-Matic transmission was replaced with a more reliable cross-drive system, dramatically improving acceleration and handling. These modifications transformed the Pershing from a sluggish heavyweight into a far more capable fighting vehicle. The new model was initially designated the M26E2, but soon renamed the M46 Patton, in honor of General George S. Patton, the armor commander who had revolutionized American tank tactics during the war. It was a fitting name. The Pershing's descendant was everything Patton had once demanded: fast, deadly, and mobile. Between 1948 and 1950, 800 of the original Pershings were converted to the M46 standard. An additional 360 were later upgraded to the improved M46A1 configuration. The changes marked the beginning of a new lineage, one that would dominate American armor design for the next 30 years. While the United States transitioned to the M46, hundreds of Pershings remained in use by European allies. Belgium, France, and Italy received them under the Mutual Defense Assistance Program, keeping them in service well into the late 1960s. For many NATO nations rebuilding their armies, the Pershing became the foundation of post-war armored doctrine, a machine that embodied both the lessons and the technology of the Second World War. Then came Korea. In the summer of 1950, the North Korean invasion of the South unleashed a new kind of war, fast, brutal, and fought across mountains and rice fields. The United States, caught unprepared, rushed its occupation forces from Japan to the peninsula. Among them were units still equipped with the M26 Pershing. The terrain was unforgiving. Narrow valleys, steep hills, and soft ground punished both men and machines. The lighter M24 Chaffee tanks, first deployed to Korea, proved hopelessly outgunned by the Soviet-built T-34-85s fielded by North Korea. Their shells bounced harmlessly off the enemy's armor. It was a grim reminder of an old lesson, the same imbalance the Sherman had faced against the Tiger. The Pershing changed that equation. Its 90mm gun could destroy the T-34 at long range, and its armor could withstand return fire. For the first time in the Korean campaign, American tank crews regained the upper hand. Although the Pershing was heavy and difficult to maintain on Korea's rugged terrain, it became the most effective tank in the early months of the war. As the conflict intensified, the newer M26 pattern began arriving from the United States. It shared the Pershing silhouette but carried the stronger engine and improved transmission. Its performance in the hills and valleys of the Korean peninsula confirmed that the Pershing's design had been ahead of its time. By 1951, the Pershings still in service were gradually replaced by M46s, but their role in restoring balance to the battlefield was never forgotten. Technically, the Pershing's influence extended far beyond the battlefield. Its cast turret and torsion bar suspension became standard features for all American tanks that followed. Its overall design, compact hull, sloped armor, and balanced weight distribution defined the blueprint for the Patton series. The M47, M48, and M60, even the M1 Abrams, decades later, carried echoes of the Pershing in its proportions and engineering logic. But perhaps the Pershing's most enduring legacy lay in doctrine. It forced the United States Army to abandon the idea that tanks existed only to support infantry or to be separated into rigid roles. Instead, it established the concept of the main battle tank, a single, versatile platform capable of performing every armored role. This shift would influence not only the United States, but also Britain, France, and even the Soviet Union. In this way, the Pershing became the bridge between two ages, the industrial warfare of the Second World War and the mechanized standoff of the Cold War. It was a tank that began as a response to the Tiger, but evolved into the ancestor of an entire generation of armored vehicles that would stand watch over Europe for decades. By the early 1950s, the last Pershings in American service had been retired or converted. Those that remained overseas continued to serve quietly, repainted and remarked under new flags. Some ended their lives as training hulks, others as museum relics. Yet every one of them told the same story, of a tank that had arrived too late to win the war, but just in time to shape the world that followed. Its steel bore the imprint of every lesson learned in combat, every mistake corrected too late, and every innovation earned through sacrifice. From the burning fields of Ellsdorf to the frozen hills of Korea, the Pershing carried within the evolution of an entire nation's understanding of war. When its engine finally fell silent, the lineage continued through the Pattons, the Abrams, and beyond. Each generation of tank that rolled out of American factories carried a piece of the Pershing spirit. The determination never again to fight with good enough, but always with the best at engineering and what could build. The Pershing's war had lasted only a few weeks, but its legacy would last for generations. It was a tank that missed its war, and yet, in missing it, defined everything that came after. When the last M26 Pershings rolled off the assembly lines, the world they were built for no longer existed. The empires that had once defined global power were gone, cities lay in ruins, and the age of armored divisions thundering across continents had reached its final chapter. Yet within the Pershing steel frame lived the memory of that struggle, the story of an army that learned, too slowly, what modern war demanded. The Pershing had begun as a question: what would it take to defeat the Tiger? By the time it arrived, the Tiger was already fading from the battlefield, but the question remained, echoing through every design that followed. It was not just about guns and armor. It was about timing, doctrine, and the ability to adapt before the enemy forced adaptation upon you. That was the true lesson of the M26. Its birth had been delayed not by engineering failure, but by human hesitation by committees, logistics officers, and the persistent belief that quantity could replace quality. For years, that belief had worked. It had built the arsenal of democracy, produced a Sherman by the tens of thousands, and overwhelmed the Axis through numbers. But in the crucible of tank warfare, numbers were never enough. At some point, innovation had to replace imitation, and courage had to be matched with capability. The Pershing arrived as that moment of reckoning. It was a visible proof that the United States could match German precision with its own brand of industrial excellence. It was not perfect. It was slow, heavy, and mechanically fragile, but it represented something far greater than its individual performance. It was the turning of a tide not on the battlefield, but in philosophy. When American soldiers first climbed into the Pershing, they felt the difference immediately. The sound of its engine, the solidity of its armor, the power of its 90-millimeter gun. All of it told them that the era of compromise was ending. For the first time, they no longer needed to rely on flanking maneuvers or air support to win an armored duel. They could face the enemy head-on, not with desperation, but with confidence. That confidence carried forward. In the years that followed, every new tank bore the mark of the Pershing. Its torsion bar suspension, its cast turret, its firepower philosophy, all became standards. But its greatest legacy was invisible, a change in mindset. The idea that American tanks would never again be built to be good enough. They would be built to be superior. In that sense, the Pershing's war never truly ended. Its spirit moved through the decades, across the plains of Korea, through the deserts of the Middle East, and into the armored formations that still define modern warfare. The M26, the M47, the M48, and the M60 all carried its bloodline. Even the M1 Abrams, roaring across the sands of later wars, owed part of its ancestry to the tank that had first proven what American steel could do. But beyond the mechanics, there was something deeply human about the Pershing story. It was born out of frustration, out of the voices of engineers and commanders who refused to accept limitations. It was built by workers who had seen the headlines of battles where Shermans burned and demanded that their soldiers have something better. It was tested by crews who risked everything in the war's final months to prove that progress, however late, still mattered. Their courage turned the Pershing from an experiment into a legacy. Every tank that followed carried more than its technology. It carried their belief that innovation was not a luxury, but a duty, because in war, hesitation costs lives and delay costs history. The Pershing was a result of both, and the cure for both. Today, when one stands before a Pershing in a museum, its presence feels almost serene. The long barrel stretches forward, silent. The armor bears the scars of a war that ended 8 decades ago. But behind that stillness is the echo of battle, Elsdorf, Cologne, Remagen, where its steel was tested and where it finally proved its worth. It stands as a monument not just of victory, but to the pursuit of improvement. In the grand story of the Second World War, the Pershing's role was small in scale, but immense in meaning. It never won a campaign, never decided a theater, and yet it redefined an entire nation's approach to armored warfare. It bridged the gap between what America had been and what it was becoming, between the pragmatic and the visionary, between quantity and quality. Its story reminds us that history is not always written by what happens first, but by what comes next. The Pershing came too late to change the war that created it, but just in time to change every war that followed. Its arrival marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, the moment when American armor ceased to chase its enemies and began to lead them. The men who drove it knew that they were part of something larger than themselves. They were not just fighting for ground. They were testing the future. And though many of them would never see the full impact of their work, their legacy endured in every engine that roared to life in the decades after. The Pershing was not flawless. It broke down. It consumed fuel greedily. Its heavy frame strained bridges and transport ships. But even its flaws taught lessons that shaped the design of the next generation. It taught that power demanded balance, that armor needed agility, and that every innovation carried a cost worth paying if it saved lives. In the end, the Pershing was the embodiment of a truth that transcends machines. That progress often comes too late for those who need it most, but never too late for those who will come after. It was a tank that missed its war, but in missing it, it prepared the world for what was to come. And so, the story of the Pershing is not one of failure, but of evolution. It reminds us that even in war, ingenuity and learning never stop. Each bolt, each plate of steel, each round fired in anger became a lesson that would protect those who followed. These machines were never just instruments of destruction. They were reflections of human determination, the drive to overcome limits, to adapt, to survive. The M26 Pershing may have arrived at the twilight of the Second World War, but it lit the dawn of a new age of armored warfare. If you wish to understand how engineering and courage shaped the course of history, stay with us. Because the machines of war are also the machines of progress, and every story, like the Pershing's, carries the echo of human ingenuity forged in fire. This is WW2 Mechanics.